Most men never ask the question directly. They meet a woman who has been single for 5 years, maybe 10, and they assume those years were emotionally neutral. They think she simply waited, quietly, patiently, like nothing inside her changed during all that time. But that is not how human beings work. A woman does not go years without intimacy, touch, desire, emotional closeness, or physical connection without developing survival mechanisms. Some become colder. Some become hyper-independent. Some learn to separate physical intimacy from emotions so completely that vulnerability starts feeling genuinely unsafe. And some bury their loneliness so deeply beneath work, routines, and distraction that even they stop recognizing it. That is the part nobody talks about. Because the woman you meet today may not be the woman she was before those years alone changed her nervous system, her expectations, and the way she experiences men entirely. This is Liza from Secrets Inside the Mind, and today I'm breaking down the complete psychology of what actually happens to women during long-term singleness, what it does to their emotional systems, their relationship with intimacy, and why so many men completely misread the woman standing in front of them. Have you ever met a woman who had been single for years and felt like something about her emotional world had become significantly harder to reach? Comment below right now. Subscribe because this video reveals the psychological reality most people are too uncomfortable to discuss directly. Before we get into the specific psychological patterns, you need to understand why most people, men and women both, consistently misread what long-term female singleness actually does to a person. From a psychological perspective, society has constructed a very polished and comfortable narrative around female singleness.
The language is all about self-growth, healing journeys, career achievement, solo travel, independence, personal development. And while all of those things can genuinely occur during periods of singleness, they represent the visible surface of an experience that has an entirely different psychological interior. Here's what the polished narrative consistently omits: the biological and emotional reality that continues operating regardless of circumstances. A woman does not stop being a fundamentally social and attachment-oriented human being because no romantic partner is present in her life. Her nervous system still generates the drive for physical closeness. Her emotional system still generates the need for genuine intimacy, validation, affection, and desire. Her body still responds to touch, to proximity, to the specific psychological experience of being genuinely wanted. Sexuality and the need for emotional intimacy are not switches that turn off when circumstances become inconvenient. They simply move underground. And here's the critical psychological principle that most men miss entirely. The longer someone lives without intimacy, the more their psychological system begins adapting to the absence of it, not healing from it, not becoming indifferent to it, adapting to it, building coping mechanisms, emotional defenses, and behavioral patterns designed to allow functional living in an environment the human system was never designed for long-term. From a Stoic psychological perspective, this connects to a principle about how human beings respond to sustained deprivation. We are remarkably adaptable, but adaptations built around deprivation are not the same as genuine resolution of the underlying need. They are survival strategies, and survival strategies, repeated long enough, become personality traits. Understanding this foundational reality is essential because it explains why meeting a woman who has been single for years is almost never as simple as meeting someone who simply hasn't found the right person yet. You're meeting someone whose psychological system has been in active adaptation for an extended period, and that adaptation has fingerprints. From a psychological standpoint, one of the most costly mistakes men make is assuming that all long-term female singleness comes from the same place. It doesn't, and misidentifying the source of her extended singleness leads to completely misreading who she actually is and what the relationship will require. The first psychological pattern is the transactional mindset. Some women have gradually stopped experiencing relationships as genuine connection and have started experiencing them as ongoing evaluation. Every man who enters her life faces an implicit audition. He must continuously prove himself worthy of her time, her attention, her emotional investment, her physical presence. And while standards are genuinely healthy and important, when relationship dynamics feel like permanent auditions, emotionally grounded men eventually withdraw. Because nobody sustains effort in an environment where warmth is treated as leverage and approval is perpetually conditional. The second psychological pattern is fear-based withdrawal. Betrayal does this. Trauma does this. A deeply painful relationship ending can rewire how someone's nervous system experiences intimacy at a foundational level. The woman who once trusted openly and was emotionally devastated rarely returns to the dating world unchanged. Part of her genuine desire for closeness remains, but another part of her psychological system now associates closeness with the specific pain that closeness produced. So she keeps men at emotional distance while simultaneously wondering, often unconsciously, why genuine connection never fully develops. The avoidance and the longing coexist. The third pattern is outdated self-perception. More common than most men recognize. A woman carries an internal image of herself and of what she deserves that was formed at a different stage of life, perhaps when her market value and the options available to her were significantly different. Rather than updating that internal image to reflect present reality, she continues evaluating every man against a standard that the current landscape cannot fulfill. Every real man feels disappointing because no real man can compete with the idealized memory of options that no longer exist. And to be fair and psychologically accurate, some women are single long-term by genuine conscious choice. Career demands, family obligations, healing after divorce or significant loss, health challenges, real life is complex. But here's the psychological truth that even strategic singleness cannot escape. Whether the extended singleness came from fear, from heightened standards, from trauma, from genuine choice, or from some combination, the emotional consequences still accumulate. Time does not remain emotionally neutral regardless of the reason for the time. This is the psychological dimension most people are most reluctant to discuss directly, because it requires acknowledging something that sits uncomfortably against the polished narrative of empowered female singleness. From a neurological standpoint, the human nervous system is designed for regular physical and emotional connection. Touch, closeness, affection, sexual intimacy, and the specific neurochemical responses generated by genuine emotional bonding are not optional extras in human psychological functioning. They are fundamental regulatory experiences. When they are consistently absent, the nervous system doesn't simply wait neutrally. It adapts. Here's how that adaptation typically unfolds. In the early months of singleness, the absence is experienced as a specific, recognizable loss, a gap with clear edges. Then time passes. The gap becomes more familiar. The nervous system starts recalibrating around the absence rather than against it. Emotional deprivation gradually stops feeling temporary and begins feeling like the new normal. From a psychological standpoint, this recalibration produces measurable behavioral and emotional changes. Some women become more emotionally reactive. Smaller frustrations carry disproportionate weight. Patience shortens. The emotional system, deprived of the regulating function that genuine intimacy typically provides, becomes less buffered against daily stress. Others move in the opposite direction, toward emotional flatness. Harder to excite, harder to reach, harder to genuinely move emotionally. When the nervous system goes long enough without affection, reassurance, and physical intimacy, it begins treating emotional isolation as its baseline state. And adjustment back toward genuine emotional responsiveness becomes psychologically difficult, not because the desire disappeared, but because the mechanisms that once generated it have been dormant long enough to feel unfamiliar. Here's the psychological consequence that matters most for men who will eventually meet these women. Independence can be deeply misleading as a signal. Some women are genuinely peaceful alone. They've reached an authentic equilibrium that doesn't require external validation. But others are simply highly practiced at surviving loneliness without visibly showing it. Those are not the same psychological state. They look nearly identical from the outside, but they produce completely different relationship dynamics. The longer someone goes without being genuinely seen and chosen, the harder it becomes, at a neurological level, to maintain the belief that they are still worth choosing. That quiet erosion of self-worth often never announces itself directly. It shows up instead in the emotional patterns a woman brings into the next relationship, in how she receives affection, how she handles vulnerability, how she interprets ordinary disappointments. If this psychological reality is shifting how you understand women you've known or are currently with, comment below right now. Tell me what pattern you're recognizing. Like this video and subscribe, because the next section reveals the specific coping strategies that develop during long-term singleness and why they create such specific complications later. The first major psychological coping strategy that develops during prolonged female singleness is the deliberate separation of physical intimacy from emotional vulnerability. And understanding this pattern is critical for any man trying to genuinely understand the woman in front of him. From a psychological standpoint, this pattern emerges from a specific calculation. If physical intimacy creates emotional vulnerability and emotional vulnerability creates pain, then separating physical from emotional creates a way to address the biological need without incurring the psychological risk. What this looks like practically: casual arrangements without emotional expectation, connections specifically structured to provide physical regulation and temporary relief from loneliness while maintaining protective emotional distance. The arrangement comes with implicit rules: no pressure, no genuine expectations, no real vulnerability. Just enough closeness to quiet what the body is asking for without risking the emotional exposure that genuine intimacy would require. In the early stages, this can genuinely feel like strength, emotional control, emotional freedom from the specific kind of disappointment that comes with genuine investment. She gets the validation, the physical connection, the temporary relief from isolation, and then returns to her independent life apparently untouched. But here's the psychological reality that this arrangement consistently underestimates. The nervous system rarely separates physical and emotional intimacy as cleanly as people consciously attempt. Over time, repeated emotional compartmentalization during physical closeness changes how the brain processes intimacy itself. A woman who spends years consciously teaching herself not to emotionally attach during physical connection may eventually find herself genuinely struggling to emotionally attach even when she finally wants to. Her system learned how to be physically present while remaining psychologically guarded. And that learned capacity doesn't simply disappear when the situation changes and real love arrives. This is where many men are profoundly confused by the women they encounter. They observe someone who appears experienced, confident, sexually comfortable. Yet emotionally, she may trust intimacy less than she ever has. What men often interpret as natural emotional unavailability is actually survival behavior repeated long enough that it has begun functioning like personality. The adaptation became automatic. The second psychological coping strategy is the quieter, more private one, and the one most men never see or account for because it leaves no visible behavioral evidence in social environments. From a psychological standpoint, when emotional and physical needs cannot be safely met through connection with other people, the psychological system often redirects towards self-sufficiency and private regulation. This strategy operates on a fundamental logic. Control eliminates the specific risks that connection with others generates. No rejection, no emotional confusion, no vulnerability to betrayal, no dependence on someone else's willingness to show up. And control, once someone has been hurt significantly enough by its absence, can become genuinely addictive. The predictability and safety of self-regulation starts feeling preferable to the uncertainty and emotional exposure that genuine intimacy requires. Here's the psychological dimension most men completely fail to consider. Private regulation and fantasy don't simply manage the biological aspect of loneliness. They create an emotional environment that has specific characteristics: safety, control, predictability, zero emotional risk. And once someone becomes genuinely accustomed to an emotional environment with those characteristics, real relationships, which are inherently unpredictable, emotionally risky, and require consistent vulnerability, start feeling more psychologically threatening than comforting. This is why some women genuinely struggle to receive affection even when they desperately want genuine love. It's not hypocrisy. It's the specific psychological consequence of spending years in an emotional environment defined by control and then encountering an intimate relationship which requires exactly what that environment was designed to protect against. Physical release in any form also doesn't automatically address emotional isolation. In fact, there's a specific psychological pattern where the momentary relief of physical regulation intensifies rather than resolves the emotional loneliness underneath. Because the relief fades and the silence that follows, the absence of genuine connection in that aftermath can feel heavier than the loneliness that preceded it. The human system is looking for something that private strategies cannot provide: the specific neurochemical and psychological experience of genuine mutual intimacy. And when private regulation becomes the primary tool for years, some people genuinely stop recognizing that their need for that genuine experience hasn't been addressed. They mistake the management of loneliness for the resolution of it. The third major psychological coping strategy is the one modern culture most aggressively celebrates, and therefore, the one most men are least likely to recognize as a coping mechanism at all. From a psychological standpoint, when emotional and physical needs cannot be safely addressed directly, the psychological energy that would ordinarily flow toward intimacy and connection gets redirected toward productivity, achievement, physical discipline, professional ambition, constant activity, perpetual motion. The woman who never stops looks, from the outside, like the epitome of the modern ideal. She is disciplined, she is focused, she is building something, she doesn't need anyone. And sometimes, genuinely, she has developed real strength and authentic independence through that period. But sometimes, and often simultaneously, the constant motion is serving an entirely different psychological function: preventing stillness. Because stillness forces confrontation with what has been avoided. A woman who never slows down never has to fully feel the ache underneath the movement. Here's the psychological mechanism: the body and the emotional system still generate the drive toward closeness, intimacy, and genuine connection. But instead of feeding those needs directly, the energy gets converted into gym sessions, into work hours, into social commitments, into self-improvement projects, into productivity that modern culture rewards enthusiastically with praise and admiration. The problem is that achievement doesn't address what the achievement was meant to help someone not feel. You can be extraordinarily accomplished and extraordinarily lonely simultaneously. And the accomplishment, while real and valuable, doesn't close the underlying emotional gap. It simply makes the gap more socially invisible. From a psychological standpoint, this matters for the relationships these women eventually enter, because the hyperproductive coping mechanism doesn't simply disappear when a relationship begins. The woman who has spent years converting her emotional needs into productivity may find it genuinely difficult to slow down enough to receive genuine connection. Stillness becomes threatening. Vulnerability in the quieter moments of intimacy feels unfamiliar. The relationship has to compete with the motion that kept her functional, and often the motion wins by default. If you're recognizing one of these three coping patterns in a woman you know or are currently with, comment below right now. Tell me which pattern resonates most. Like this video and subscribe, because the final sections address what all of this actually means for men who are genuinely trying to build something real. Here's where the psychology becomes most critical for men who are genuinely trying to understand and connect with women who have spent extended time alone. When survival strategies repeat consistently enough over a long enough period, they stop functioning as strategies. They become automatic. The nervous system stops requiring conscious, deliberate engagement of the protection. It simply engages it by default. the woman no longer consciously decides to maintain emotional distance. Her psychological system does it automatically, usually before she's even aware it's happening. This creates a specific and deeply confusing dynamic for men who enter these women's lives with genuine emotional availability and healthy relationship intentions. He shows up consistently. He communicates clearly. He demonstrates genuine investment. And yet she still seems emotionally restless, difficult to fully reach, prone to pulling back precisely when closeness increases. What he's observing is not personality. It's adaptation that has become automatic enough to function like personality. The walls built for protection during years of loneliness don't simply disappear because the right person arrived. They remained engaged because the psychological system that built them hasn't received enough new data yet to fully deactivate them. This is especially visible in specific behavioral patterns. She craves genuine closeness deeply, then pulls back with urgency the moment she receives it. She wants emotional safety, but experiences it as threat when someone finally provides it consistently. She struggles to trust consistency because her nervous system is more familiar with the psychological landscape of uncertainty and emotional isolation than with the sustained experience of being genuinely chosen. Here's the most psychologically important truth about this pattern. Time alone does not automatically create emotional wisdom. Sometimes it deepens the survival mechanisms rather than transcending them. Some women genuinely grow during singleness, become more self-aware, more emotionally mature, more honest about what they need. But others become better and better at emotional survival, while quietly losing the full capacity to connect in the way that genuine intimacy requires. The difference is not the duration of the loneliness. The difference is whether the emotional experience of that time was processed or simply survived. And processed pain leaves a fundamentally different psychological fingerprint than survived pain. Here's the dimension of this conversation that requires the most psychological honesty, because it addresses a pattern that is both genuinely harmful and genuinely understandable given what produces it. After enough disappointment, enough loneliness, enough emotional survival, some women stop simply protecting their heart and start protecting their worldview instead. The pain they experienced and never fully processed becomes the lens through which all subsequent experience is interpreted. You hear it in the language, "All men cheat." Relationships only drain women. Men are emotionally unavailable. And what sounds like confident opinions or hard-won wisdom is often, not always, but often, a psychological defense system operating beneath a surface of apparent certainty. Here's the specific psychological function these narratives serve. If every man is fundamentally the problem, then she never has to examine the walls she built herself during those years alone. The external attribution of all relational failure provides complete protection from the internal examination that genuine healing would require. And here's the most psychologically costly element of this pattern. When unresolved pain has been absorbed deeply enough into someone's sense of self, healing starts feeling threatening rather than relieving. Because healing would require vulnerability again. It would require genuine openness to the possibility that not every man is what her experience taught her to expect. It would require facing the specific adaptations she built during survival, rather than continuing to direct attention outward. When pain becomes identity, the defense mechanism is no longer protecting someone from external harm. It's protecting the internal narrative from the revision that growth would require. And at that stage, a healthy and consistent man entering her life doesn't resolve the problem. He becomes the test subject on whom every accumulated expectation gets confirmed or disconfirmed. Here's the practical psychological framework that changes how you engage with every woman who has spent significant time alone. The wrong question is whether she has a complex past. Every adult has a complex past. Expecting otherwise is psychologically naive. The right question, the one that emotionally intelligent men learn to ask, is what her past has turned her into. Because the same period of extended loneliness can produce two completely different psychological outcomes, depending entirely on how it was experienced internally. One woman emerges from years of singleness with greater self-awareness, more emotional honesty, deeper clarity about what she genuinely needs and why. The loneliness was processed, reflected on, made sense of, integrated into her understanding of herself. She's not without marks from the experience, but those marks became insight rather than armor. Another woman emerges from the same duration of singleness with the adaptations of survival more deeply embedded than when she entered it. The loneliness was not processed. It was survived, managed, worked around, distracted from. The survival was real and required genuine strength. But the emotional gap underneath remained unaddressed, and the mechanisms built around it became more automatic with each passing year. These two women require completely different things from a relationship and present completely different psychological realities to the men who enter their lives. And from the outside, in the early stages of connection when chemistry is present and attraction is active, they can appear nearly identical. Here's what to actually pay attention to. How does she talk about her years alone? With clarity and some honest ownership, or with bitterness and complete external attribution? Can she reflect on her own patterns from that period with any degree of genuine self-examination? Or does every story end with someone else bearing full responsibility for every outcome? How does she handle closeness as it increases? Does she lean toward it or consistently create distance at the specific moment vulnerability would increase? Those patterns carry more information than anything she consciously tells you about herself. Because the adaptations built during survival always reveal themselves, not in what people say about their past, but in how they behave when the present asks them to do what the past made difficult. Here's the final psychological truth I want you to carry forward. You are not looking for a woman without history, without marks, without the evidence of years that were difficult. That woman doesn't exist. You are looking for a woman who didn't allow those years, the loneliness, the survival mechanisms, the emotional adaptations, to permanently disconnect her from the capacity for genuine intimacy. Because some people survive loneliness and return to themselves. Others survive it and become their defenses. And understanding which one you're actually engaging with before you're deeply emotionally invested is the most important psychological reading a man can develop. Do you think long-term singleness creates genuine wisdom or primarily emotional distance? Comment below with your honest answer. This is the psychological question at the center of everything this video has addressed. Like this video, if it gave you psychological clarity about patterns you've observed but couldn't fully articulate. Share it with a man who needs this perspective before he enters a relationship without understanding what he's actually engaging with. And subscribe to Secrets Inside the Mind, because this level of psychological depth about what human beings actually become during periods of prolonged emotional isolation and what that means for the relationships they eventually enter is the understanding that makes the difference between genuinely connecting with someone and perpetually misreading them. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one. I'll